welcome back to my channel. I am super excited to be here. I apologize for being so long between my last video and this one, but I have a whole series in mind now, and so I will be posting at least once a week for the next couple of weeks, and then hopefully I'll be posting about once every 2 weeks. But the series that I wanted to start was on women in ministry. And the reason I wanted to do this was because I was on TikTok a couple of weeks ago and I saw this post about somebody talking about women being in leadership, and there's just a lot of genuine questions about how you should interpret some scriptures. And so I wanted to come and just kind of answer some of those questions in case some of you also have them. And because it is a topic I'm passionate about, because obviously I feel called to preach, and so I wanted to just share why I feel that it's not because I'm ignoring scriptures or anything, but I do have a belief behind each scripture that says something that people tend to use against women. And so in order to start, you have to kind of lay a foundation and a base work before we get into some of kind of the more controversial verses. And so what I wanted to start with was how women are actually introduced in scripture. And so the first time we see women, it's right after God has just created Adam, and he says, it's the first thing that he created that he said, this is not good. And so he says, I'm going to create a helper so that he is not alone. And so what he does is he takes a rib from Adam's side and he creates Eve. And so there's two important things that I think you have to recognize in this passage. And the first is that God could have taken Eve from any bone in the body, but he chose to take her from the side. And I think that that is to symbolize equality, because he could have taken her from the hand or from the foot. He could have taken her from anywhere, but he took her from the side. And I really, with everything inside of me, believe that it is because he wanted to symbolize that they are equals. The second thing that you have to see in that story is that it says that he created a helper. And so I think a lot of times that's what people will use to say, like, oh, he created a helper. And so they automatically assume that that means like servant instead of just helper. They say, oh, like she's beneath him, she's there to serve him. But when you look at that word in the Hebrew, it's Ezer, it's E-Z-E-R, and so it means helper. And the other times you see it throughout scripture, it is usually paired with El, so it's El Ezer, and so El means God, Ezer means one who helps. And so a lot of times what it's saying in scriptures, it's saying the God who helps. And so what you have to understand from that is that that means that if you're going to say that in Genesis, I think it's in chapter 3, whenever it says helper, if you're saying that that's derogatory, then you have to apply that to every other time that that word Ezer comes up, which most people will agree that if you do that, that would be blasphemy, is to say that the God who helps is placing him beneath. That would be very blasphemous. And so you have to recognize that that's not actually what it meant, was to be somebody who's underneath, but just somebody who helps. And so that's how women were initially shown in scripture. And so then the question is, how does the fall impact that particular area? And so, as most of you know, the story of the fall, Eve ate from the fruit. She turned to Adam, gave him some of the fruit, and so he also ate. And so something that I think is interesting about that is, I don't know why, but I always grew up with this image of like Eve was alone and then she had to go and find Adam, but Adam was right there the whole time. And so I think sometimes we give Eve a little too much crap to be like, oh, like you were the first one, but Adam was there the whole time. He just wasn't really doing anything, because it says that he was with her. They were there together. And so they were both there, both being tempted. And so she did it, and then she convinced Adam to do it. And so he could have definitely stopped it, is all I'm saying. But that's not really super important to what I'm talking about. So anyways, after they ate from the fruit, they each have curses that were put on them. And the one that I really want to focus on is that God says to Eve that her desire will be for her husband, and he will rule over you. And now this has been a greatly discussed topic, is what is God saying is the woman's desire? That is talked about all the time, is what was the woman's desire? Because it kind of doesn't make sense there if you're like, your desire, what desire? Like sexual desire, desire to serve, like what are you talking about there? And so what's interesting is that if you look 15 verses later, that same kind of phrase is used, but it's when Cain is talking, or I'm sorry, it's when God is talking to Cain. He says, sin will desire to have you, but you must rule over it. And so when you kind of compare those two, it took me a while looking at those two to get to this conclusion, but I don't want to go into all the detail of this. But what I kind of figured out, and what some of my teachers have also told me, is that I believe that her desire there is actually to rule over her husband. And so basically what it's saying is that before the fall, everything was great. Everything was together. Adam and Eve were on the same page. They were doing everything together. It was so harmonious. And then when sin entered the world, that is when conflict entered. And so when sin entered, the power dynamic took root. And so now Eve is going to want to rule over Adam, but because of the fall, she is not going to. And so that is what I believe that God is saying there, is that he was saying that at one point you were all together and you were harmonious, and now there is going to be conflict and there is going to be a power dynamic between the two of you. You are going to want to lead, but he is going to rule over you. And so that brings the question of, how does Jesus change this? Because I think a lot of times what we focus on in scripture, which this is definitely the most important part, is that we have this focus on that sin, when sin entered, it broke the relationship between us and God. But when you read the scripture in the way I just described it, you can also see that sin broke the relationship between man and woman. And so Jesus came to restore everything that was broken from the fall. And so I believe that he came to restore the relationship that was broken, not just between us and God, but between us and men. Because all of the time, you see people, we put the victory of the cross over everything. The victory of the cross over sin, over sickness, over demonic possession, over everything. We put the victory of the cross over it, which we should be doing. But for some reason, we're not living in the victory of the cross in this aspect of men and women. There are so many people out there who still believe that women should not be able to preach, that they should not be equal, that they are somehow still below. But Jesus came to empower women, to bring back the dynamic that they were originally created to, which was to be co-heirs, which was to do things together. And I think that that's also a very important point, because I have been in ministry for a while and I have seen some women who really just despise men, of that they've kind of created this hatred for men in general. And the thing is that we were originally created to be co-heirs, which means that if we as women decide to take up the mantle and to do all of these things, but we're trying to degrade men in the process, that is not how God intended it. God intended it to be co-heirs, to be together. And so you have to recognize that when we talk about the victory of the cross, Jesus came to restore not just our relationship between us and God, but everything that sin broke, including the relationship between man and woman. Here's the thing, as I go into the next couple of videos, I will be talking about some of the more controversial verses. And so what you have to recognize is that the context of everything that I'm talking about is so different than the context that we live in today. Because I think I've had a lot of people who have asked me, who aren't really Christians, they ask, like, why would you want to go into ministry when this is kind of how women are portrayed in scripture? And my answer is always, because when we look at it through our lens, through our culture today, yes, there's a lot of things that seem very demeaning towards women. But if you look at it from the culture that it was in, you can see that actually Jesus and even Paul empowered the women of their time. Because if you look at the cultural context of it, the women that Jesus was with, you weren't, in that time as a woman, you weren't really supposed to speak to anybody who wasn't your husband. And so the fact that Jesus spoke with women, the fact that he let women sit in while he was teaching in his home, they were in those small kind of more intimate moments, you can see that Jesus was actually empowering the women of his time. It just doesn't look like it does today, because we have grown from that. We have become empowered. We've become to where we are equal to men, where we have the same opportunities, we have the same education. But if you look at it through the cultural lens that Jesus was in, is that Jesus empowered the women that he was with. Women were the first people that he told to go and tell of his resurrection. And so as we go into these next couple verses, I just want you to keep in mind, I will be going through some of the context of the verses, but you just have to keep in mind that as we are reading these scriptures, is that it's different to us reading it now than it was in that time. For example, it'd be like if I decided to do a sermon series for some people in Texas. And so I sent them a sermon series and I was like, this is for you. And then let's just say I was feeling lazy. And so I said, I'm also going to send this to some people in Africa. It would not hit the same things because the cultures are so different. And so there'd be some parts that you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. And then there'd be others that you're like, that doesn't really make that much sense, because you have to look at the context that it was written in. And so as we go forward, as we go into these next videos, I just want you to keep that in mind, is that we're looking at different contexts. And so if you have any questions about women being in leadership or women being in ministry, I would love for you to message them to me and I will make sure to add them in to one of these messages. But I am super excited for this series. I hope you are too, and I hope you have a blessed week, and I will see you next time.